Yes. I want to welcome to the show Sharon Hodde Miller. Sharon, welcome.
Hi, it's great to be with you.
I am so excited. I was telling you before we hit record, I recently heard you on Allie Worthington's show, and hearing you talk about control, I was thinking, oh my gosh, I immediately sent her a text saying, how do I get Sharon on my show? We need to make this happen. So tell us a little bit behind the heart of your new book, The Cost of Control.
Yeah, there are a number of things behind it. So my husband and I lead a church in Durham, North Carolina. And one of the things that I'm always asking as a pastor, caring about the spiritual growth of my people is what is forming them? What are the things in not just our church, but in our culture that are forming them? And the pandemic gave us a really interesting glimpse into what is forming us, what is forming Christians in our culture. When the pandemic hit and our anxiety spiked, I think a lot of us blame the pandemic, like this is why I'm feeling this way. This is why I'm responding this way. And of course, that is true to some extent. But what it also did was it revealed a lot about how we responded. And so what I was seeing, especially in those early months, was this control response where people were, it was as if it reminded me of, when you poke an anthill.
The ants have always been inside of there. But
yeah. I have kids, and so if they see an anthill, they'll take a stick and or they'll step on it, and you immediately see the ants just come out. You didn't know they were under there, but they just come out and they're scurrying to rebuild this anthill. And I feel like that's kind of what we all looked like. It's that this illusion of control had been damaged or shattered in some cases. And so everyone is frantically rushing around trying to rebuild a sense of control, a sense of certainty, a sense of predictability. And so it was fascinating just to see what this revealed about our relationship with control, how spiritually unprepared we were for the pandemic. And so that really got the wheels turning. And I realized, okay, this is an issue I want to dig into deeper. But as a pastor, I also believe that my teaching is strongest when it is coming from my own personal convictions of my own sin.
This isn't just like an observation that you made of other people.
Yeah, I mean, it would be super easy. It would be super easy to like stand over everyone and, point out all the ways that they need to be more like Jesus. But yeah, I realized I also had some control issues that were being revealed during the pandemic. And mine were, I was less afraid about even my husband, his control issues came out just in terms of the leadership of our church. Our church is less than 4 years old right now. And at the time, it was a year and a half old. And so a pandemic for a young church plant is an existential threat. Church plants are already very fragile. And so my husband really his anxiety really spiked about our church. But for me, I started to see it come out in my parenting. I was, stuck at home with my kids. I have 3 children. At the time, my youngest was 2. And my kids are super loud. We have no introverts in our family. We have no shy children. Yeah. And so they were super loud, fighting, all of that. It just felt out of control. And so I felt trapped. I felt angry all the time. I started to try to exert control over my kids by being louder than them. So if they were going to be loud, I was going to be louder. And this was also a control response. And so I was seeing it in my church. I was seeing it in my husband. I was seeing it in myself and realizing this is a major issue for Christians. And I think that we've all known that, like we know we shouldn't control. But the question then in my mind was, well, then what? What do we do about this? Because I've been a Christian my whole life. I know I shouldn't try to control things. I know that it's sin. I know that it's idolatry, believing that my life would be better if I was in control instead of anyone else, including God. But knowing all of that, in the midst of it, was not helpful at all.
Mm,
And the birth of this book was me reframing it in a way that actually motivated me to finally let go of control. And
mm.
that's why I wrote this book.
I'm curious, like the counselor in me, I'm curious of like that transformation in your own life,
Mhm.
or maybe in your readers that you've seen. What is that? What is the byproduct or the output of that? What does that look like after?
Mhm. Well, at some point, and it's funny, I can't even remember how I came to this realization, and it's in the title, The Cost of Control, but seeing in Genesis 3, the original sin is really about control. Adam and Eve are in Genesis 1 and 2. They have everything essential to thrive. They, have peace, they have freedom, they have agency. There's only one thing they don't have, which is control. And ultimately that becomes the sticking point where they reach for control to empower them in this new way. And every time we reach for control, for that same sense of, empowerment, or to soothe our anxieties, whatever it is, we
Mhm.
reenact that moment, but we also reenact its consequences. And so what we see immediately with Adam and Eve is anxiety. We see shame. We see brokenness between them, and brokenness between them and God. And so when we reach for control, we also reenact those consequences. We experience anxiety. We experience shame. We experience brokenness in our relationships. And so I think connecting the dots of realizing that this is a formula that has been written into creation since the fall. It's inescapable that whenever I try to control something in my life, or to control a person, I'm going to reenact those consequences as well. It is not an if, it is a when. And that was really clarifying for me
Mhm.
in those moments where I'm trying to control my kids, and realizing, yes, I am called to be their parent. I'm called to be responsible for them, to discipline them at times, to teach them. But if I try to control them, then years down the line, I'm going to discover that will have broken my relationship with them. And anyone listening who has had a parent like that knows, what it's like to be controlled by someone. Similarly with my husband, and I've seen this happen because we're leading a church together. When we're trying to make a decision, and I think I know what is the best decision, and so I know how to pressure him, and I know how to coerce him, and I'm very verbally strong. You can tell by me talking, nonstop. I'm very verbally strong. I know how to make him make the decision I want him to make. But
Mm,
what I have discovered is I can do that. can succeed at that in the moment, but it will cost our marriage. And I've seen, we've been married 13 years now, and I'll admit I've seen the fallout of that. And unfortunately, once you realize the damage that has been done, it is not something that can be quickly undone because it's
mm,
taken so long. And so that was really helpful for me now in those moments where I'm, disagreeing with my husband and thinking, okay, I can try and control him, but it's going to cost our marriage. It just is. And is it worth it? Is it
right.
worth it to the cost of my marriage? Similarly with the people in our church, I can try and control them, what they think, how they live, the decisions that they make, but it's going to cost my relationship with them. It's always also going to cost my own mental health because
Totally.
I'm going to be the one laying awake at night rehashing these conversations. And is it worth it to pay that cost? And so that was the thing that was really motivating. I know I should let go and let God. I know I should surrender. Maybe it's my personality though. What really kicked my tail in gear was knowing it's not just that you should do this, it's that it will cost you
Yeah.
if you continue down this path. And I realized I don't want to live that way.
Mhm.
So I don't know if that answered your question. That was a long answer to your question.
Well, it was a very good answer. And as you're sharing it, it feels very sobering to me
Hmm.
for us to be reflective on the way that you control is going to be different than the way I control.
Hmm.
And even the way your husband or my husband or any of us, like we all have our own flavor,
Hmm.
if you will, of control.
Yes.
And that's sobering. It's not just a you thing, or you know
Right.
what I mean? You being
Hmm.
talkative or strong. I think
Yeah.
we should even be controlling in our quietness and
Hmm.
in our passivity. There's control there as well. So I'm
100%.
curious, what would you say is the antidote or the solution to control?
Yeah, well, it's fascinating. A lot of people ask, okay, when you realize you're controlling, what should you do instead?
Right.
And I think there's a version of that question that is, to be quite honest, still about control. Because it's kind of like, how can I not control but still get the result that I want, you know?
Right.
And so, what I tried to do in the book is to zoom out a little bit and go back to that moment in Genesis 3 where this all
Yeah.
began, and then look back to Genesis 1 and 2, because, what we're really craving is that life that we had in Genesis 1 and 2, where we didn't experience chaos, where things weren't broken, where we felt secure, where we felt stable. And in Genesis 1 and 2, Adam and Eve are not in control, but they are empowered. They are free. They have purpose. And so the word that I gave to describe that, and I would really be curious to hear your feedback on this just as a counselor, but the best word that I could come up with is agency.
Mhm.
And I think agency, it's a little bit different than free will, because it's sort of like what you do with that free will. It's that sense of, I have power to influence myself and to influence my circumstances, but it is a power with limitations. It's not
Totally.
control. It's a limited power, but I can partner with God in my life. And so in Genesis 1 and 2, we see a lot of different forms of agency. And so I spent the last section of the book looking at what those different forms in Genesis 1 and 2 are. And one of the first ones we see is naming and ordering.
Yeah.
And, this is how God, responds to the chaos, is he orders it. And then he commissions Adam to do the same. And this is a really powerful form of agency, is ordering. And it's something that I even actually has relieved a lot of my guilt about, because I love to clean my house. When things feel out of control in my life, I go into cleaning my house. And I used to think, oh, this is just like another control coping mechanism. And to some extent it is, but it's also I'm imaging God in that. I'm doing like what he
Yeah.
created, like he created me to name and to order. And so if I'm going to that to give me like a deep spiritual peace, then that's not the right reason to go to
Totally.
that. But I think we are expressing like our God-given purpose when we order. And then a really practical way this played out during the pandemic is, I was trying to control my kids by yelling at them, basically.
Mhm.
But one solution that I came up with later on was to give my kids a schedule. One thing that they needed was a schedule.
Mhm.
And once we instilled this structure into our days, it didn't solve everything. My kids didn't magically turn into model citizens, but it actually did help a lot. And without fracturing my relationship with them in the process.
Mhm.
And so that's a really powerful form of agency, is ordering. Another one that I talk about is the importance of restoring limits in our lives, because as I mentioned, agency is this influence within limits. They operated within boundaries, and we live in a culture that tends to believe that freedom is the absence of boundaries, but we just don't see that in Genesis 1 and 2. They're not free because of the absence of boundaries. They're free because of them, and how important it is to be proactive in operating within boundaries. And so, one really practical way that we can do this is by restoring limits in our engagement of technology, and
Mhm.
specifically social media and the internet. One reason why we feel so out of control, one reason we feel anxious, is we have a control relationship with technology,
Mhm.
where we expect technology to provide us with this almost godlike omniscience and certainty and
Mhm.
predictability, and it fails us regularly. I tell this story in the book about when I had depended on my weather app, like to give me this infallible knowledge of the future on the day of my son's
You're saying
birthday.
refresh, refresh, refresh.
Yeah, well, this one day we were doing a pool party, and the weather was all day long. It says 0% chance of precipitation. But then as we're at the pool and I'm setting up, I see storm clouds on the horizon. And I look at my weather app again, and all of a sudden it says 70% chance of precipitation. Like it changed in 30 minutes. And so I start yelling at my phone, like, what good are you, weather app? What good are you, meteorology, all meteorologists? Is this even a science? I'm just like cursing the weather app for failing me, because I expected it to empower me and to give me certainty and predictability, and it had failed.
Totally.
And so a lot of us have this control relationship. It's creating this illusion of control that just gets shattered like all the time. And so it's important for us to have appropriate expectations for our technology, but to also have limits on our technology. Like it's not good for you to be ingesting news about the world all the time. So that's another really healthy form of agency.
I love that. One of the words that really sticks out to me is influence. And the work that I do is, and I'm researching this more and more, but it's about the embodied self. And so paying attention to what you're feeling and that mindfulness. And when I control, I can definitely feel a shift in my chemical, my physical self, right? My chest gets tight, my jaw clenches, my pupils probably dilate. Like it sends off this like cascade of responses. But when I think about influencing and boundaries, like that makes me feel calm. It makes me feel more relaxed, more connected. And so I think when you're talking about cleaning on the surface, you can't really say if it's like, quote, control or agency. But I think as we practice and become more aware, I think it really empowers us to be more connected to ourselves and even to have curiosity of like, whoa, I really am controlling right now. Like, why is that? What's going on? Like, have I been on my phone all morning scrolling through news and that's why I'm feeling this way? Or is it this, or is it that? I'm curious what your thoughts are.
That is a great example of paying attention to how you're feeling in the moment. And that is, I recently heard Rich Velotis. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he's a pastor in New York. And he said that in his congregation, they talk about the body being a major prophet, not a minor prophet.
Ooh, I love
that the body tells you how you're feeling before you even know how you're feeling.
Totally.
And I think that's so true. Like I woke up in the morning the other day and my jaw was sore,
Yeah.
And so I've been clenching my jaw all night. That's a great indication that you're anxious about something. And so learning to pay attention to your body is really important. But then also, and this is another why I think naming is a really powerful form of agency, is in that moment. I think one of the things that happens is we name incorrectly or only partially correctly why we're
as Christians, we shame with it. I shouldn't control.
Yeah.
So I think that to tie into what you're saying, I think that contributes to it being difficult to name it, because I think we're so shaming with ourselves and how we name it.
Yeah. Well, and I think too, we misname when we feel anxious. I think we often say, well, it's because of this thing that's happened in my life, this person that I love who is making really destructive decisions. And there is a lot of truth to that. But what happens is we miss out on the reality. The other source of our anxiety is that we're trying to control the situation. And that is what is ratcheting up our anxiety. We get caught in this cycle where we reach for control to soothe our anxieties.
Exactly.
And it only exacerbates our anxiety even more. And so naming correctly and accurately what is actually happening is really, really important.
Yeah. One of the stories that came up for me as I was reading your book, which I loved, by the way, I loved all the research to it. I love the personal examples. It's just so helpful and such a great resource. When my son was about 5 weeks old, he was hospitalized and for feeding issues. And the doctor gave us a whole host of like really scary things of what it could be. And they were ruling out some really hard things. I remember looking in the mirror and being like, I can either be afraid of like everything, because I never would have thought about him not being able to swallow. And that's what it was. He was having a swallowing issue. I never would have thought of all the things I read in parenting books leading into being a mom, all the different, everything, So I can either be afraid of everything, or I can choose to let go and recognize that I'm in control of just a small, teeny tiny little sliver. And I think for all of us, we all have those moments that it's so hard to control. I think as moms, it's especially hard because we want our kids to do well and to be well. But
yeah.
yeah.
And that's really important, because it's not just, some of us are controlling just because of pride, sin, idolatry, whatever it is. But sometimes we wrestle with control because the world is genuinely frightening.
Yeah.
And, when we're talking about your kids, especially your kids' health, there isn't much that is scarier than that. And I think it's really important to also acknowledge that's a huge component of why we struggle with control in the first place, is that we live in a Genesis 3 world, but we were created for Genesis 1 and 2. And so when our souls are crying out for that stability and that security, that is not sin, and that is not wrong. That is, God put that in you. That's what you're created for. And that he hears that cry, which is why he sent his son in the first place. And I think that note of grace and comfort is so, so important when we're talking about control as well, because these are really vulnerable, raw, terrifying, often things that are kicking up our control issues.
I love the grace behind that. Because I think, again, we think don't control, don't be controlling. It feels like a 4-letter word, but when we look at, well, I mean, you just lost your job, or your marriage is ending, or you don't know this, you don't know that. There's so much uncertainty, and it's false. It's a false solution to think that control is going to be your way out.
Yeah, 100%. It's a false gospel.
Powerful. So this year on my show I'm doing a year-long series, because I feel like, who are we kidding? It's way more than a year, but to give us a little parameter. So it's all about being healthy mentally, spiritually, emotionally, all the different parts of ourselves. And when I read your book too, I thought, man, out of all the roadblocks to our health, I think control is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, roadblocks to health. What are your thoughts on that?
That's a really interesting idea. It's definitely, I think it's a huge source of our anxiety in our culture. As I already mentioned, we are in a culture that constantly promises us control, not just through our technology, but even, our health industries, our beauty industries, they're constantly saying you don't have to age, you don't have to, or if you just have this diet, you're not going to get cancer, and then obviously our smartphones, our apps, they all promise us this mastery over the world. And it's all just an illusion. And so one of my big concerns is that whenever we retreat into the illusion of control, we neglect an opportunity to grow closer to Jesus and to just grow spiritually, to grow our muscles of faith. And I'm concerned that we live in a culture that, because it has created such a convincing illusion of control, our spiritual muscles of faith and trust are just atrophying. And I think we see that whenever that illusion is shattered, and it's so strange because it's shattered all the time, like every day. It's shattered in so many ways when our technology fails us, or if we still can't lose that weight, and yet we're still operating out of this illusion that I can somehow make this work. And I think the frayed edges of our souls are that anxiety that is created by that relationship with control. So it's definitely a huge issue for sure.
Can you say that again about how control atrophies our faith muscles? Like, I totally got a picture of like a shriveled up muscle when you said that. I think there's such power behind that statement. So I wonder if you could just say it again and then say it in another way.
Yeah, I'll say it in a different way. So I'll go back to what I said at the beginning about noticing everyone's response to the pandemic. You know, one of the words that was used a lot was unprecedented.
Oh yeah. That's taking me back. How many times did we hear that word?
I know that word's gonna be triggering to people now. Don't tell me I don't want to
Having
hear
like
about anything
flashbacks.
unprecedented. Yeah. But the fact of the matter is the pandemic was not unprecedented. You know, there's been every generation has, you know, like every 100 years, there's been pandemics. There's still people alive from the last one, you know, in 1913 or when was it?
I think it was like 1920 or I can't even
Yeah,
remember now.
the Spanish
31.
flu, whatever it was. Yeah, there's people that lived through the last pandemic, you know, and we read about pandemics in the Bible. You know, there's all sorts of plagues and pestilence and famine and uncertainty. And so we have been handed down, you know, scripture from fellow brothers and sisters in Christ who lived through actually worse
Mhm.
worse than what we're facing. You know, they were persecuted, they were oppressed, you know, there
Mhm.
was a shorter life expectancy, all of that. And these are the same folks who by the inspiration of the Spirit wrote rejoice always,
Yeah.
you know, be content in all circumstances, that we have access to a peace that transcends all understanding. And so we are heirs to tremendous power, you know, not just through Christ and the Holy Spirit, but also, you know, spiritual disciplines through, you know, the wisdom of scripture. And it was like we had not been prepared to make use of any of them when the pandemic happened. And I think a lot of that goes back to the fact because we were living in a world where we were essentially promised of our increasing mastery over the world, our increasing
Yeah.
control over the world, that thanks to technology, we have, you know, more certainty than ever, more predictability than ever. And to some extent that is true. You know, our life expectancy is longer. You know, we can travel across the world, you know, in just days. We can travel, you know, across the country in a day, and that would have taken weeks, months before. We have so much technology that is a huge gift. But I think what happened is and I write this in the book, we are living as if our control over the world has increased by miles when it has
Mhm.
only increased by inches.
Mm.
And in comparison with God, the gap is still as wide as it ever was, that we just don't have that much control over the world. But because we are constantly promised that we do, I think it's really easy to lean on that and depend on that. And there's a whole chapter on the illusion of control
Which
and
I love.
how,
I love that phrase.
yeah, it was really fascinating because it's an actual psychological term, and there's been a lot of research showing that when you believe you have control, it registers measurable mental health benefits. Like your anxiety is lower, your depression is lower when you believe you have control, whether or not you actually do at all.
Right.
And so that's why it's so enticing to live in this world where you believe you have more control. It actually does make you feel better until that illusion is shattered.
The short-term solution.
Yeah. At which point, as I mentioned before, you discover, oh, I've not been doing the spiritual work to live in the actual world. And now I'm confronted with it and I'm not ready. And I think that's what we saw with the pandemic.
Mhm. Did you watch Friends? Like, do you watch
Oh,
Friends?
yes. Uh-huh. It's
Uh-huh.
been a long time, but yes.
That's just one of my go-to like comfort shows. And so it makes me think about the episode where Joey gets his credit card statement in the mail, and it's like pages and pages and pages.
Uh-huh.
I think taking control is a bit like that. It feels good in the moment
Uh-huh.
until you
Yeah.
get that bill in the mail, and it's like, I
Uh-huh.
can't pay for this.
That is a great
I don't know what to
analogy. I
do.
love that. That's such a great illustration. That's exactly what it's like.
Yeah, it takes a lot of practice. And again, I think that awareness is so key as a first step. So I know there's not like a 1, 2, 3 with this, you know, as
Mhm.
far as steps go, but if there were to be some practices that we can begin being more
Mhm.
intentional about to
Mhm.
really walk in the real promises that God has for us
Mhm.
versus the false illusion of control, what would those
Yeah.
practices be?
Yeah. Well, I want to suggest another form of agency that I describe at the end of the book, which doesn't sound like a form of agency at all, but is really, really important. And that's the practice of self examination. So in Genesis 3, after Adam and Eve eat the fruit, God goes to them and says, "Where are you?" They've
Yeah,
hidden, and God says, "Where are you?" This is a rhetorical question
totally.
because God knows where they are. He's omniscient, and a tree isn't, standing in his way, like because they're hiding in a bush. He's not suddenly confused. And so this is a rhetorical question that he's asking Adam and Eve. And what he's really asking them to do is to ask themselves that question: Where are you? What have you done? And both of them are unable to respond. They're unable to answer that question correctly because they both shift into blame mode. Instead of saying, "This is what happened, I believe this lie from the enemy," instead of, taking it to you and asking if this was really true. That is not the answer that we get in Genesis 3. Instead, Adam simply says, "It was the woman you put here."
Mhm.
He asked the same question to Eve. She is also unable to examine herself and shifts into blame and blames the serpent. And so I would say this is we've already talked about how your anxiety manifests in your body.
Yep.
Um, that realization, you can't really get to it without the practice of self-examination. And so whenever you are feeling that urge to control, to just take a beat. Just take a beat when you feel afraid, and just to ask, okay, what am I feeling right now? Where am I, so to
Mhm.
speak? And why am I responding this way? Is this going to give me the result that I think that it will? How is responding this way making me feel? That's a really huge step that a lot of us are never able to take. We shift into blame mode too. It's this thing that caused me to feel this way. That's why I feel this way.
So either
And
shame or blame.
yes, exactly. Exactly. 100%. So that's a really big one. And then, the other thing I would say is remembering what I said earlier about God knows. God knows why you feel afraid. God hears the cry of your heart that you are not alone in feeling this way. It is why he sent his son. It is why Jesus came, and to bring it to him, and to know that at the end of the day, we cannot fix the things that we want to fix. We just cannot. But to try is a terrible burden that we were never meant to bear. And so that's another helpful reminder in some of these really hard and impossible situations, is to know that God hears, that he is present, he cares, and at the end of the day, that is why he sent his son in the first place.
I love that. That's part of the work that I do with clients, is helping them to realize here's like the little tiny sliver of what is mine
Mhm.
versus everything else that it's God's. It's like maybe 1% is mine and
Mhm.
99% is his. But
Yeah.
so often we try and control, at least I do, the 99 versus
Mhm.
owning that one little percent, which is
Mhm.
mindfulness,
Yeah.
fixing, awareness, and
Mhm.
reflection.
Yeah.
That's really beautiful. And it's a really hard work. And one of those things that's not just a one and done thing, right? I
Yeah.
mean, it's like,
Mhm.
check that off my list. I don't never have to deal with that again.
Yeah, it's forever. It's forever. As long as the world is broken.
Mhm. Well, I'm curious, in your own life, what does that look like for you to have more awareness of control?
Mhm.
And I'm just curious because the more you shine a light on it, the more you see it.
Yes.
And so I'm
Uh-huh.
just curious, like what, and we'll end with that question.
Yeah, I mean, there have definitely been moments in my marriage, in my church, where when I can feel myself when my will is in conflict with another person's will, that to me is always a great moment to stop and ask, is this worth the fallout of
Mm,
what I am trying to push here? And so that has been a really huge help for me, with my husband and with my staff, is to realize what I'm trying to do, and it doesn't very often it doesn't look like I'm being a controlling leader. I'm not yelling at people. I'm not being aggressive. I'm not being passive aggressive, but I'm, gently
The
using
power
my
struggle is there.
leverage, to compel someone to do something that I think that they should. And it is going to cost my relationship with them. So that has really been helpful to realize I don't want to pay that cost. And then the other has been realizing in those moments, because sometimes when it's scary, when it's something that is really urgent, you don't even have that presence of mind to have that thought. It's like you're off to the races, just thinking, okay, what do I need to do right now? Your heart is racing. You're doing all these sorts of things. And still kind of further down the line of that panic and trying to, fix things. Thanks to working through this, I now am better able to stop at some point and say, wait a second, hold on. I am making this worse right now. Like
Mm.
it's bad. It was already bad, but I am now making it much worse for myself.
Mhm.
And so that has also been really helpful.
So good. As you're sharing, it makes me think about the more we do our own growth and exploration, the more humble we become, because it's
Mm,
realizing we got a lot of icky in there.
yes,
It
I
can
have a
feel like
lot for sure.
oh, I'm beyond that. But no, the more
Yes.
that we allow God to answer or to come into where are we right now, there's still a
Yeah.
lot of healing to be done. Well, Sharon, this
Yes.
has been all so good. Where can we find you? Where can we get the book?
So the book is available anywhere books are sold, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, all that. And then I'm most active on Instagram, so you can find me at Sharon H. Miller.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
It's been great.